There we go. Oh, I've only been, using this for several years, and I'm still figuring it out. Yes. Okay. Well, before we begin, Rob, would you feel comfortable praying us in? Thanks, Rob. Thanks for the mention about the rain. We are coming up on Memorial Day weekend, and it wouldn't be Memorial Day weekend without big rain somewhere. So, you know, keep it in your prayers. Uh, Good to have everybody here. We are continuing our slow walk through the book of Acts, and it's really getting exciting here for Brother Paul, who he's in Jerusalem, and at the suggestion of the church leadership there, to basically chase off a bunch of rumors that Paul is uh, telling Jewish Christians that they can't act Jewish anymore. They basically say, Paul, why don't we got some believers here who need to finish up a particular vow that they started. Why don't you go with them to the temple and complete the vow with them and pay their expenses? And that will satisfy all these rumors that you have forsaken your Jewish heritage. Well, sounds like a good idea. And 90% of the time, 90% of what Paul did was a good idea, but it's in a lot of situations, you know how it is. It's that last 10% that gets you in trouble. And that's exactly what happens to Paul. He, as he's coming out of the temple, uh, some some folks that he has met from his earlier missionary journeys sees him, and these are folks who do not like Paul. They have they had a run-in with him somewhere, didn't like him at all. We're gonna get this dude one way or the other. They see him, they shout stuff about, hey, Paul, this guy here he's trying to bring our brethren down. He's actually bringing Gentiles into the temple. You know, really silly stuff because Paul, any upstanding Jew would have known better than to try to bring an unbeliever or Gentile, worst of all, into the temple because you could get somebody killed that way. And in fact, that's what almost happens to Paul. These Jewish enemies start a riot. They grab Paul. They're in the process of killing him, as Luke points out. When the Roman soldiers show up and they arrest Paul, and when all else fails, arrest the victim. Just of whatever's going on. It seems like a good plan. Anyway, they take him in. They're about to take him into the barracks, and Paul says, "Hey, wait a minute! Great audience, great opportunity here. Let me speak to them." And the commander lets him do that. And last week we read Paul's uh, what was kind of like a flashback moment where he talks about how he was converted and talks about his background. He says, "Hey, I am I'm not just your average Jew. I'm super Jew here. I I was trained under Gamaliel. I was and everybody knew who Gamaliel was, one of the great teachers of the law. Paul studied under him. He was one of the fast rising members of the Pharisees, probably even the Sanhedrin, and he would have had a wonderful career as a Jewish leader and teacher. except for that encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, and that moment of conversion. And Paul talks a little bit about that, and he talks about how 2 years later, Jesus tells him, you need to leave Jerusalem. I have plans for you. Uh, I want you to take the message of the gospel, and I'm going to send you far away to the Gentiles. And up to that point, Paul had their attention, but he lost them at the word Gentile. I mean, it was as big a profanity as anything you could utter in the temple site. When he says the G word, uh, the uproar resumes, along with the cries to kill him, and people are shouting. They're throwing off their cloaks, the better so they won't have any restrictive arm movements when they start throwing stones at Paul. And the commander, for Paul's safekeeping, puts him into the Roman barracks, which is next to the temple site. But he also thinks, well, let's get to the matter of this. Why are people so upset with Paul? Let's talk to him. More than talk to him, they're stretching him out to flog him, as though, well, if we flog him enough, maybe what he's telling us will be the actual truth. And Paul at that moment knows what's going to happen. They're stretching him out on the post, and they're about to start whipping him when he says, is this really legal to do this to a Roman citizen? And that freezes everything because, oh, wait a minute, what's going on here? Because this is one of the things you do not do to a Roman citizen unless he has been convicted of some kind of a crime that merits that kind of punishment. And so when the commander finds out, he says, he goes to Paul and says, are you a Roman citizen? Paul says, yes, I am. Commander says, I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. Paul says, but I was born a citizen. Those who were about to interrogate, i.e., flog Paul, withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. I mean, this guy is in deep doo-doo because you don't do this to a Roman citizen. Now, granted, hey, all they have to go on is the word of Paul that, hey, yeah, I'm a Roman citizen. Well, there's some insurance against Paul lying, because the penalty for lying about your Roman citizenship is that it was a capital offense. You could be put to death. Oops.
I really didn't mean to say I was a citizen. I was actually, I'd signed up to take the test, and
It's while they're leading them to the chopping block. But that was the guarantee against someone lying about their actual status as a Roman resident. And we talked briefly about how do you become a Roman citizen? And obviously you were a citizen by birth, and that's actually Paul's situation. Uh, he grew up in Tarsus, and one or two things may have happened that benefited Paul and his family. There is some, according to some commentaries, when the Roman government conquered Tarsus, uh, at some point they did grant citizenship to all the residents there. It's also possible that Paul's father, he did become a citizen, because otherwise Paul would not have been said, I was born a citizen. Obviously it came from his family. How did his father become a citizen? Well, either by being a resident of Tarsus, or some service that he performed through the empire, and he was granted that, or through his political connections. And we had, right as class ended, we had a question about, where did all these, what about slaves in Roman society? Because one thing, the third option, if you weren't born a citizen, if you weren't granted it by the government, you could purchase it. You could buy your way out. Maybe they had an installment plan. We don't know, but you could also buy it. But the question came up last week at the end of class: where did all these slaves come from? So I did a little research, and here's what we know, or here in a nutshell is what we know about slavery during the days of the Roman Empire. It was widespread. Of the entire world population that was under the rule of the Romans, about 10 to 20%, that population total, were slaves. Well, where did all these slaves come from? A variety of ways. There were, if you were a prisoner, if you fought against the Romans and lost, and you weren't executed or beheaded or exiled somewhere, if you were a prisoner or a captive of war, you became a slave. Congratulations. Good news is you're going to live, you're a slave. The bad news is you're going to live, you're a slave. That was your starting point. That was your introduction to Roman society. You could have gone, you could have been a member of on a ship, basically helping with the rigging and the loading and the unloading of the cargo. Or you could have gone on a pleasure cruise. And doggone it, luck was not on your side. And one fine day, here comes this pirate ship. They capture your boat. They capture all the cargo that's on it, and they capture you as they set fire to your boat or sink it or both or whatever. And well, you look like you're in reasonably good shape. You'll fetch a really good price on the slavery block. So if the pirates capture you, they take you back and they sell you on the open market. Bummer. Third option. Where did the slaves come from? Hard to think about it, but in some cases it was actually voluntary. You get into debt, and it's not just, oh, I'm behind on my credit card. No, you are seriously in debt. You're making what, $20 a week, and somehow you're $20 million in debt. No way that you're going to pay that off. And so, okay, well, what do we do? Okay, well, I'll sell myself into slavery. I'll become somebody's servant. And that was a third option. One other thing was that the slavery class was self-perpetuating. It was basically if a boy girl and a slave girl met, fell in love, started a family, had children, the children were born into slavery. They themselves were slaves. If you were a slave owner with reasonably young slaves who got married and produced children, hey, good for you. You've got 2 or 3 or 4 more slaves. However many children they had, they're part of your your slave category. So it was self-perpetuating, basically, and if you have enough of them, the slavery population could replenish itself. I had to think of the right word to say, and self-perpetuate for generations and on end. Well, what did slaves do? Well, a variety of tasks. The obvious one was that they did all the grunt work. They built things. They cleaned houses. They cleaned cities. They did the work that nobody else wanted to do. Some gladiators or some slaves, if they had the strength and the physical capability, became gladiators. And since slaves were so expendable, hey, if they won the Colosseum, started fighting all those lions or each other or whatever, had those Spartacus moments. They died. Well, at least they had their moment of glory when they stood before the emperor and raise their whatever and say, "We who are about to die salute you." Um, there were, if you were, physically attractive, you could be one of the sex workers in one of the godly temples, say of Athena or Diana or whatever. You help fulfill that function. If you were one of the better educated slaves, well, and you were bought by someone, one of the wealthier landowners, you could actually luck out. You could administer that person's estate for them. Hey, I can take care of that. Don't worry about. I'll figure out your taxes, what you have to pay, and and I'll keep an eye on assets and liabilities and the income and the outgo. Make sure you don't go bankrupt. If he was really smart and the slave owner had kids, I can educate those kids for you. They got problem areas in math or whatever or geography. I'll be their tutor, and so that's what some slaves did. Or if nothing else, they could babysit the kids. That's one less headache for the parents, so they could entertain themselves and other things. So there were what slaves did ran the gamut. All said and done, at the end of the day, slaves had no rights, absolutely no rights. If the slave owner wanted to put the slave to death, he just wanted to kill him right on the spot. And if you really wanted to, you wanted to keep things really Jake with your owner, because if he was hot tempered and in a bad mood or whatever, if you really messed up in any way, and your owner was mad enough, he could kill you on the spot, and he would not have to explain anything to the authorities, because you were not a human being per se. You were property. It was, and killing you was no more than just putting an animal to death. It's brutal, but that's the way. That was the way of the slaves. If you were a slave, were you a slave the rest of your life? Well, in some cases, a slave could obtain his freedom with the owner's consent. If the slave actually did some remarkable feat that tremendously helped a Roman official, even the emperor, they could earn their freedom that way as a reward for their loyalty and their 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 sacrifice. Uh, but and if they acquired enough money, they could buy their way out, especially if they had sold their way to begin with. If the owner was willing, they could purchase their freedom. But other than that, it was a slave's lot was not a good one. They were at the bottom of the social structure in Roman society, and it was a structure. It was we're talking about at least 10, maybe 20% of total Roman citizens who were slaves, and that was a part of their society and culture that lasted apparently as long as the Roman Empire did itself. So it was a fact of life, but on one other aspect was that the Romans did believe in civil rights, and Paul, at the right time, plays the citizenship card, saves himself a really terrible flogging, because unlike Jewish law, in fact, some key differences between Jewish law and Roman law. One of them was with regard to slavery, in to the degree that, because it was true, especially in Old Testament times, that in Jewish society, you could have slaves in your family, but it was in almost all cases it was a voluntary situation, and it was meant to be temporary to take care of a debt or a particular situation. At least, yeah, 7 years. And in some cases, if the slave and the owner liked each other a whole lot, they decide, hey, we can't live without each other, then the slave could go through a ceremony that allowed them to be that family's slave for life. But again, it was totally voluntary on the slave person's part to continue that relationship. Not so much in Roman society. The other thing, the other difference between the Romans and the Jews had to do with flogging. You know, uh, Romans, I mean, the Jewish law basically said no more than uh, 40 flogs from the whip. And just to make sure they didn't violate the law, they stopped at 39 just in case somebody miscounted. That was the explanation. Romans not necessarily limited. If they really felt like they needed to keep going until they got what they extracted whatever information or confession they wanted from you, they kept at it. So Paul did the right thing. He announces his citizenship. That stops the whole thing that was about to happen to Paul. And the last verse of chapter 22, my personal feeling was this should really be the start of chapter 23, but nobody asked me. But verse 30 says, the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. Well, we can't flog him, so let's see what we'll do. This is what he does. The next day, he released Paul and ordered the chief priest and all the members of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Congress, to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. What a spectacle. Paul, who probably in his younger life was a member of this august body, this legislative council. And now he's not of them, he is in front of them as a potential enemy. So Paul, as we open chapter 23, Paul opens with his plea. How do you plead this, Paul? Guilty or innocent of of creating a riot, of campaigning against your own brethren, of being disloyal to your own race, to your own people, to your own traditions? Paul says, and Luke records that Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin. He looked earnestly at them and says, my brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. I plead innocent. I am one of you. I have lived the life of a righteous Jew. Hey, well, that's your plea. In most situations, especially in our American courts, that you're filing your plea, and we'll go from there and hear the evidence. Not so much here. Because in verse 2, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Now, we don't know how they struck him or in what manner or how hard. It could have been this symbolic tap, kind of like I challenge you to a duel kind of thing. Maybe just enough sting to make it register. Or the guy could have, fisted up and really plowed into Paul's mouth and knocked him, where he's sprawling him probably, where he's, takes Paul to regain his senses. Maybe he's bleeding out of the nose. Maybe he's bleeding from his mouth. Maybe he's dislodged a tooth. And it's really hurting. It's really smarting, It's no love tap. And this may have prompted Paul's response here in verse 3. Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. By the way, that's an insult. Basically, it means it's what do you do when you whitewash something? Well, it's, you make it all look all nice on the outside, but when you whitewash, when you paint something with whitewash, you're doing it basically to cover up the scummy undersurface. The fact that it's, the wood is old and it's rotted and it's not pretty at all. He's calling him a hypocrite. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. So Paul spits back an insult. He's angry, and rightly so. That's probably just you wouldn't expect any other situation or response when you are struck unexpectedly like that. Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you? How dare you insult God's high priest?" To this, Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was a high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Paul has enough presence of mind to be quoting scripture. This sentence is actually from out of Exodus chapter 22. And it's an interesting response from Paul, who just a second earlier called the high priest a hypocrite. And there's this situation it's interesting to read the commentary. What did Paul mean? What was the intent of Paul's response? Although there are those who argue that that was a sincere response, Paul, in his training, would not have wanted to or not have desired to insult the high priest. If so, why did he do it? Well, they quote the thing that a lot of folks like to talk about Paul, the physical infirmity, Paul's so-called or speculated eye ailment. Maybe he had cataracts. He probably would have been of age where that would start being a problem. Maybe he was just nearsighted. They really didn't have glasses back in the day. If you were nearsighted, it was just everybody looked a little fuzzy. And the justification for that is to look at Paul's letter to the Galatians. And they look at two passages, chapter 4, where beginning of verse 12, where Paul says, "It was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you, and you were so receptive to what I preached. You were so enthusiastic and supportive and loving that you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me," which was kind of a weird thing for him to say, unless he was referring to an eye problem. And later on in Galatians, as he's wrapping up and he's doing his personal signature to signify that, yes, this letter actually came from me. I'm the author of this letter, even though a professional scribe wrote it down for me. Paul says, "See with what large letters I use as I write you with my own hand." If you write large letters, it could be because you really are nearsighted and you really can't see clearly what you're doing or writing. Well, that is an explanation, and can't argue with that. Second explanation is, Paul has been out of circulation as far as Jewish circles is concerned, especially Jewish political and power circles. He hasn't really been keeping up with the power brokers in Jerusalem. Now, it's still Ananias is still the high priest, but this is Ananias at least 20 years after maybe Paul last saw him. So Ananias has a little bit of mileage on him. He looks familiar, but not quite the same. And of course, there are some different people who are in the Sanhedrin, folks who Paul does not know at all. So it could be maybe he just didn't recognize who Ananias really was, even though as high priest, Ananias would have particular markings and costume. The third explanation, and I don't vote in favor of any of these, but I kind of like this one, just because knowing what we know about Paul, maybe Paul was being sarcastic. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were the high priest, Mr. Ananias, even though you did something that was very unhigh priestly of you. But we know you would never do that, right? Even though you just did. And we know enough about Paul that he was not above using sarcasm or using that barbed commentary to make a point. Ananias, you may be the high priest, but that doesn't excuse you doing things that don't measure up to your stature in life, to your calling as a high priest. You should be ashamed of yourself. Well, while all this is going on, Paul is reading the room. He's looking at, what's going on with, the body language, the whispering and the murmuring that's going on with the Sanhedrin members. And he's looking at them and he's thinking, you know what? This ain't going my way. This will never go my way. I'm not going to get a fair hearing out of this. They're probably going to put me back in prison. That may be the nicer thing that happens to me. For all I know, they may try to put me to death. They may try to execute me on the spot. So Paul does something very interesting here. He may not know everybody in the Sanhedrin by name and by face, but he knows enough about the politics in the Sanhedrin, and he decides to exploit that. Verse 6. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I am a Pharisee's Pharisee. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." Now, up to this point, no one has ever mentioned, let alone worried about the concept of the resurrection of the dead, but Paul takes this and lobs it into the discussion here. Turns out to be a verbal hand grenade. Because when he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. Oh, really? That's putting it mildly. It's about to turn into a food fight. Have you? Let me plant the vision in your mind, because this is what's about to happen. Have you ever seen on if you've watched world newscasts recently, when they cover news from the world, the occasional video from a Congress from a particular country overseas, especially in Eastern Europe, where they have a bitter disagreement over legislative policy, and it goes really, really bad. I mean, how bad? They start fighting each other. I mean, and it turns into a brawl. People are climbing over tables. They're jumping on people. They're trying to punch everybody else's lights out, and it looks like it looks like a session of worldwide wrestling or it's hilarious, or until you realize, hey, these are elected officials, and they're supposed to be behaving as elected officials, and maybe they are, but it's just the discussion gets shut down while everybody fights each other. This is what happens. Why? Well, Luke includes this parenthetical in verse 8. The Sadducees say that there's no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. The two great political factions of Jewish religion, not only Jewish religion, but Jewish politics. Pharisees, and we have talked about how oh, just what a mess the Pharisees are, how legalistic they are. There's 613 rules. How does anybody live the life of a Pharisee and really die a happy person? You can't. But to their credit, at least they are closer to following the scripture than the Sadducees, who are the classic, oh, we've evolved. Yeah, we don't believe in the resurrection. We don't believe they're angels or spirits. We've evolved. We've grown past all that. We don't believe in fairy tales like that. It's what you see here is all you get. You only live once, so go for the gusto while you can. So, big dividing point. So, Paul knew what he was doing when he raises the issue, the resurrection of the dead. Luke says, verse 9, that causes a great uproar, a, a dissension. If this meeting was catered, at this point, it starts turning into a food fight. Some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man. They said, what if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? Good heavens. Paul now finally has some allies. Paul, the Pharisees' friends. And, Paul actually was a Pharisee. He knows what he's talking about. He knew the right argument to bring up. Well, obviously, the Sadducees have something else to say. Push comes to shove. Don't you look at me when you say that. I don't like the tone of your voice. And by the way, I don't like, your mother dresses you funny. So what do you think about that? Huh? And suddenly it turns into one of those parliamentarian brawls that we see on cable TV news. The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. You can only imagine what's going through the commander's mind. Like, here we go again. Good grief. What is it with these Jews? Another day, another riot. Oh, gee. He's probably thinking, how many more years till I put in my 20 and I qualify for my pension? I could retire. I can go back to Italy. I can go build that little bait and tackle shop on Lake Como I've always been talking about. Take life easy. Till then, I got to put up with this. So once again, Paul, in the commander's eyes, is in physical danger. It's not, hey, if this guy gets killed for whatever reason, it's not looking good on my resume. Get him out of here before anything happens. That's what happens. He ordered the troops, go down into the well where in the council chamber where the Sanhedrin was meeting. Take Paul away. Take him away from them by force if you have to, and bring him back into the barracks. Well, Paul actually was set free. Now he's back in the barracks. Oh, gee. Kind of a bad day. Or at least, if I were Paul, I would be thinking, that argument got me out of a really bad situation, but here I am in the barracks, not much better. Gee, things just seem to have gone south ever since I set foot in Jerusalem. Wonder what I can do. I wonder what I will do. Paul might have been thinking, this could be the end of my life right here as I know it. I could be put to death tomorrow. All this work that I've done, and things just come to a screeching halt. And yet, that night, the Lord stood by Paul and said, take courage. Now, that's very interesting, the way Luke describes it. And there's speculation, okay, if Jesus is there in the prison, is this in bodily form? Is this in a spirit? What? We can't really go much past what Paul has or what Luke has described here. And this is all the information we have. But what we have here is that, yes, Jesus is here. Paul is receiving encouragement from Jesus, and he's receiving it in a form more than just it's more than a feeling. It's more than some kind of a spiritual, ooh, I got that. In some way, Paul sees Jesus. Paul experiences Jesus saying these words, "Take courage, as you have testified about me and for me in Jerusalem. So you must also testify in Rome." Yeah, Paul, don't worry about it. Don't let anyone tell you that you're about to die, because I still have work for you to do. You've talked about all this time about wanting to go to Rome. You're going to go to Rome because you got work for me to do there. So this was great encouragement for Paul. And as it turns out, it is encouragement in a timely way, because things are as bad as they are just about to get even badder. Next week, we're going to look at a death threat, that a plot that is formulated against Paul, and will he or won't he survive that? Of course, if for those of us who've studied Acts multiple times, we know that there's even more stuff that Paul has to endure, but he has this actual firsthand reassurance from Jesus. It says, "Don't worry, don't be afraid, be courageous. You still got work for me to do." So don't let whatever is happening around you discourage you or frighten you. You're going to get taken care of one way or the other. But for now, Paul has to get out of that barracks. In fact, Paul has to get out of Jerusalem, and his exit and his departure is not assured, or there's some question whether he walks out on his own feet or he's carried out. So next week, if you will, please read the rest of chapter 23. We'll see about the details and see what happens to him there. The most interesting and the best is yet to come. So thank you all for being here today. I hope you enjoyed the lesson, got something out of it. And Lord willing, we'll meet back here next week, next Sunday, Memorial Day weekend, I believe, and see what happens to Paul. In the meantime, have a great week. Pray for rain and stay cool. We'll see you next Sunday.